The ISO stands for International Socialist Organization. We are a group devoted to, in the short term, working for gains that benefit large numbers of people, as opposed to the wealthy and powerful, and in the long term, building a society that's more reflective of people's needs, of equality, of cooperation, than it is of competition and aggregation of wealth upwards.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, we are an organization that's trying to bring together all the elements of people in the society who want to fight against exploitation and oppression. We believe that it's the working classes sort of objective position in society to be able to transform society into something new. And that new thing would be a society that's dedicated to people's needs and not to profit and exploitation, as we were saying before. So although we believe that the working class is crucial to that ability to carry that out, for us, we also want to fight against all forms of oppression, all forms of exploitation. And so for that reason, we are fighting we're fighting against racism in this country, internationally as well. We fight against Islamophobia. We fight against sexism. We support the rights of all oppressed people in this planet, and even specifically in the U.S. And by trying to bring together all these elements, we will be stronger together and be able to wage a struggle more effectively and with more victories than losses, which I think is all about developing the combativity of working people and the independence needed for them to do that education, do that work, organize and struggle in an effective manner. So I believe Islamophobia is the ideological and sort of political and organizational form to oppress and to justify continued attack on Muslim people, not only in the U.S. but internationally. The U.S. has a lot of interest in the resources that the Middle East, the natural rich resources that the Middle East has. Not all of it, but major sections of it. So to maintain geopolitical control over those resources and to have involvement and intervention in that area, they need to justify to the American people why we spend so much money and why we send so many people to die and kill people over there. So Islamophobia is that ideology that justifies it and that creates a sort of consensus in American society to go ahead and do these things.
That takes the form in a lot of media and cultural things, even in religious discussions, of saying, perpetuating various stereotypes about Islam to make, and people who practice Islam to essentially paint them as less deserving or less capable of their own self-determination. So whether it's labeling Islam as inherently violent, or labeling it as inherently sexist, or anti-science, or anti-civilization. All of those things are used to justify conquest and subjugation of these peoples, even though they cover wide numbers of languages, wide numbers of countries, wide numbers of practices, varying levels of adherence to differing parts of the Quran, or even texts outside of the Quran. It paints them as one massive block of people who believe a certain way, and that way is in direct conflict with us. And because of that, we need to fight them and defend ourselves from this sort of violent barbarism.
Yeah, it's also a way to divide and conquer. It's a way to divide and conquer working people in this country so that they tacitly or implicitly are okay with, half the GDP being spent on war and all of that which comes with it as well. So it's also one of those tools of divide and conquer against the working majority. So I believe Islamophobia and the roots of it lie quite a few centuries back. I think it starts with the the conquest of the Ottoman Empire and parts of it that originated when you have French colonialism, British colonialism, and all these like Western European countries trying to move into other pieces of land for natural resources, for control, for power, and to dominate for the sake of being on top, right? And so to justify the conquest by Napoleon, by the British, of Egypt, of Algeria, by the French, and all that, you need to create an ideology to then, like we said before, to sort of give the consent to the people of those countries to say, okay, that's fine, that makes sense, go ahead and do those things. So, and it originates really with this sort of Orientalist, quote unquote, Orientalist idea or concept. And so, you know, the way that the Middle East and Muslim countries in general were painted were as despotic, as static, as non-changing, as a lack of rights generally, no democracy, and so it's counterposed to the sort of Christianity and the democracy and the civilization and the modernity of the Western countries. But that had really very actually any sort of factual bearing on the realities of the people of the Ottoman Empire and generally the Middle East, North Africa. So that, I think, is some of the roots of it. Now, obviously, it's taken a different form, but there's still a lot of clinging to those ideas and those stereotypes. And once again, it's to justify war. It's to justify military intervention and occupation and imperialism generally across this planet. If there was, you know, there's natural rich resources in a whole bunch of other places on this planet, and ideologies must be created to justify that intervention and the spending of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars on military equipment, while people in this country go without medical care, go without, you know, effective or quality education and access to education all around. So how do you justify not giving education to somebody, but spending billions of dollars to go into Middle East, North Africa? Well, Islamophobia is that ideological tool to justify that. And so that's sort of, those are some of the origins of it, is back with colonialism in the 17th and 18th century, and it's continued to this day.
Julian pointed out a little bit, you know, a lot of the roots of Islamophobia, though they seem very different, are rooted in this, in kind of dialogues that we're still forced to listen to on the news now. There's this idea that the United States represents democracy and advancement and liberty and acceptance of everyone and kindness to women, even though you can go back through history and find endless examples to refute all of them, and examples to refute all of them in the present. There's still this idea that we're more advanced, we're more enlightened, and that we're going to bring that to these other countries who are violent. And if we can't make them not violent, then we will control them. We have to keep them locked up in some way. So you see echoes of that in certainly post 9/11, but you see a lot of it in the talks about Israel and Palestine. Is if we let these Palestinians have self-determination, they're going to kill us. If we let Iran have nuclear weapons, they're going to use them on us. And that takes out America's role in militarizing a lot of these groups. First of all, you look at Al-Qaeda and a lot of those groups that America armed as allies to us to fight Russia or to fight battles over there. And that's how they got their weapons to begin with and their training. But it also ignores America's role in the anger that these people feel in being subjugated, of not having self-determination, of not having rights, of not having clean water, of not having economic opportunity. And when that anger festers, eventually violence is going to come out. And then America is going to pretend to take the high road, like we don't approve of this violence, but we're inflicting that violence and hundreds of thousands of times worse on civilians, on women and children who are not involved. So when, as Julian pointed out, when we watch the news and we go, Israel just blew up a Palestinian hospital or a Palestinian school and killed a bunch of children with the United States supplied weapons and money. Well, how do we make ourselves okay with that? Well, we go, they elected Hamas, that's what you get. Or you're a violent people, that's what happens when you store missiles in schools. That's the cost of doing business. And so we see echoes of those same kind of ideas, that they're less civilized, that they're less deserving, that they're more violent, in those same kinds of conflicts now.
The current climate in the West around Islamophobia is really intense. It's ratcheted up more recently because of the sort of catastrophe that has resulted from years and years of occupation and military occupation, control, degradation, subordination of the peoples of the Middle East and North Africa. So the response from it, so we see the rise of ISIS. And that rise of ISIS itself is a result of sectarianism that the U.S. has manipulated in Iraq particularly, and the despotic regimes that the U.S. and the West has supported against the efforts and wants of and aspirations of these people in those areas. So the U.S. continues to send billions of dollars to the Egyptian military, which is now taken full control, is throwing protesters, people who want democracy, into prison. They are committing acts of terror, basically, on the population.
Saudi
Arabia has been, right. Saudi Arabia has, and this is just the massive contradiction that exists, right? So the U.S. wants to fight ISIS, which is itself challenging some of these ideas that the U.S. and the West has imposed in that area. And they want to do it by calling, them Islamofascists, all those things. And to some degree, I think most people in these areas don't even want ISIS and the control that they have. ISIS has actually been reported in destroying history. Now, whatever. I don't want to get into that as much as actually point out the fact that the U.S. has played a huge role in creating this situation altogether. So in an effort to then justify, more involvement, more military intervention, more bombing, more spending of money and destroying of people's lives in that geopolitical area, we need to whip up, the U.S. government and the West needs to whip up more Islamophobia to justify all of that. And, there's this, as Alan was pointing out, this glaring contradiction because, we say that they hate us for our freedoms and what we're going to go do is free them and liberate them. But during this entire discourse, we're dropping bombs as if that's going to liberate anybody. War and occupation never liberates anybody. And while we're saying that, we're, cozying up with Saudi Arabia, which has been in some ways almost the source of this counter-revolutionary efforts by ISIS and whatnot. So to us it's very contradictory. It's not in any way helpful in clarifying what's actually happening in that area, and it's trying to, like I said, create more consent so that people can justify more involvement and intervention in those areas. Yeah.
In the U.S., what we see is this huge double standard where, for example, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, everyone's saying, Muslim leaders have to come out and denounce this, or peaceful Muslims have to speak up. But when dozens of mosques are attacked after the Charlie Hebdo incident, or the Houston Islamic school is burned down, Christian leaders, white leaders, atheist leaders, in North Carolina, no one's demanding them come out. In part because that's ridiculous. Who are white leaders? Who are Christian leaders? Who are to even assign this idea that there's one person or two people or three people that can come out and speak for 1.5 billion people is completely absurd. The other part about Islamophobia is that for people who are going to join ISIS, or people who are enchanted by the idea of ISIS, we should say that even though we're against American imperialism, ISIS is not the way to fight it. They're not about liberating anybody. They are a group that is not about the liberation of people. They're about their own power under the auspices of liberating people from the United States. But you have, Kurdish rebels who are fighting them and us because they know what our involvement means and they don't want our help. And you have to understand that there are people in the Middle East who, in Iraq, Afghanistan, who are teenagers and young adults who don't know what it's like to not live under United States bombs. And so, one, they've been totally dehumanized. The value of life has been, bombed to nothingness. So, death is not that unfamiliar to them. And it's the same as joining a gang in South Central LA or in the Bronx. Life isn't offering you much hope. There's not a lot of opportunity. So death, dying for a cause, dying for what you're trying to get, is not off-putting. So they have no problem going and doing these things because violence is what they've grown up with. Violence is what they know. Violence is what has surrounded them from birth, literally falling from the sky. People who have never been to the United States, people who have never met an American. The only American they've met is somebody pointing a gun at them. And so what are they supposed to do? But instead of offering economic opportunity, instead of liberating these people, we use that as an excuse. We use their violence or their expression of their rage as excuse to lock them down more. And that feeds into this idea that we have where we go, they're just too violent. They're savages. Well, what else have they known? What else have these people been exposed to aside from this? So many of them know somebody or have experienced themselves firsthand American and Western violence. And so these organizations hold appeal to them because they don't know how to express that rage and that kind of helplessness in any other way.
And this all really has to do, ISIS is a tiny minority of the population, and is in no way operating in a democratic way, is not listening to the aspirations of the people in the areas that they are controlling, has instead created a sort of reactionary way to repress and oppress people in those areas as well. So it's not in any way the masses of Iraq or Syria.
Democratically seizing control.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a complete operation of a minority group who are imposing their beliefs on a majority of people over there.
Through violence and repression.
Through violence and repression. And when that's the case, it just becomes very difficult to sort of overturn that, especially when every other form of organization that's existed to combat this has been systematically destroyed, undermined, and repressed by the regimes that the U.S. has put in place in Syria, in Iraq. Saudi Arabia obviously is the continued support of that regime, and all this has created this sort of situation right now, which is bubbling into this issue with ISIS, and then U.S. continued involvement and other Western countries' continued involvement and destruction only feeds that a little bit more. So definitely, I think that the current climate of Islamophobia in the U.S. and in the West generally is very high right now. We see it not only, what's interesting also is that you see far more attacks against Muslim people in the West during times of elections, because that's when politicians espouse the Islamophobia even more violently so that they can justify getting into office, getting votes, whatever that might be. So then you see these things. And then you see a Western media that doesn't cover it as effectively or says it's a parking lot issue with the Chapel Hill murders. Are you kidding me? Was that the case in Texas when that mosque was burnt down? No, it's not about parking lot issues. It's about real Islamophobia that's being spouted to the American people and to the West, and they then go ahead and commit these acts. These acts of terror. Those are acts of terror, and this is just a chain of ideological control. Before it was the war on communism, then it was the war on drugs. Now it's the war on terror. And these are all ways to sell to the American people and to the West why we must spend more money on killing, destroying, occupying people outside and not giving those resources to people domestically within those countries. So it's another string of that control, of that domination, exploitation of American people by our own government and by people outside the U.S. That's a big question. I personally believe the solution to the problem is the self-activity of working people in solidarity with the Muslim community to fight, the Islamophobia, but also the military occupations, the wars, and the funding of those wars in the billions and trillions of dollars in this country. We have to fight that. We need to stop it right away. That is the objective situation. Ideologically, we need to continue to support and fight alongside the Muslim community, the Arab community generally speaking, and peoples of oppressed countries that the U.S. continues to be involved in. I also believe we also need to bring light to the situation of how funding funding is being distributed, and I do believe that at the forefront of it all needs to be those communities who are directly affected by this leading that struggle, and organizations like the ISO supporting that and fighting alongside those folks. So for example, the Strangers and their efforts to educate people around what Islam actually is, to combat the stereotypes. I think the ISO needs to be in support, and alongside, the Strangers continue to fight against the Islamophobia that the U.S. is perpetuating, and the West generally speaking. I also believe we need to take action. We need to be out on the streets. We need to be protesting. We need to be mounting campaigns around this or against the Islamophobia and the way it manifests. We need to shut down Guantanamo Bay, the prison that continues to imprison Arab and Muslim men for no reasons, almost altogether. Dozens of years some of these people have spent with no trial, no charges, no representation, almost no representation. We need to shut down the police department, the NYPD, spying on Muslim communities. It is a complete violation of democratic rights that apparently the U.S. supposedly upholds, but is backtracking on for certain communities. So these are some of the ways, and we need to end war. We need to stop the war. That is so crucial to fighting and ending Islamophobia.